Jonty, I've got a pretty urgent question for you today. Would you describe yourself as a striver, a seeker, a finder, or a yielder? And you can have all of the above if you want.
Have you been back at your self-help books again, Sophie? I
You know
know
I
how
love
much
it.
you love.
I love a self-help book.
Wh-
Yes.
Who is the author of this self-help book,
A very
Sophie?
surprising author, as a matter of fact. Shall I spoil it, or would you like to answer the question first?
Oh, let's answer the question. I like to think I'm not a yielder, although I have yielded on
Yeah,
occasion.
not very
Um,
often, though.
I like to think I'm a seeker. Who doesn't? All the best people are seekers. Not so much a finder, definitely a
Hmm.
striver. So I think I see life as a long, prolonged
Alpha plus for
struggle.
striving for you.
Yes, I
Yes,
have a camp going on. I have a my struggle.
nice.
What about you, Soph?
Let's see. I think not coincidentally, I think I probably map pretty much onto the same metric that you've just outlined there. I am not a yielder. That's a real point of pride for me. Don't yield, especially when it's something like my husband driving or my children suggesting things for dinner. Striving. I mean, I am Sophie Striver G. Love to seek, but I love to find, Junty. I love to find.
You're
Yeah,
all of them. You're
I'm
all
all
of
of them
them.
except yielding.
You never
Um,
yield. It's true.
like
You rarely yield.
no, should we have the big reveal?
Let's have the big reveal.
The author of this number one best-selling, well, actually, it was a bit of a failure initially, self-help book is none other than Alfred Lord Tennyson, the subject of today's episode.
This is the secret life of books. I am John T. Claypole. I am very tall. I have a Spanish complexion, a massive mane of hair, as you can see, Sophie. I have a
Yeah,
Spanish hat, a beard, a cloak, and I like nothing more than reciting my own poems, particularly the long ones, at dinner parties, whether or not anyone there wants to hear them.
that's absolutely splendid. I'm Sophie G. I'm a sort of angel in the house. I'm the ideal Victorian wife, besotted, beloved, massively good at generating children, keeping the home fires burning, supporting my man, beloved by all. Uh, in fact, I'm going to go so far as to say I'm a bit of a yielder, Jonty. This week, Ulysses by Alfred Lord Tennyson. So, Jonty, we are forging ahead. We're striving and seeking, and we're not yielding on our quest for the ultimate Odyssey. And as you've said, long life is generally a good thing, especially if you're Odysseus, but rarely if you're a poet. Had Alfred Tennyson died young, like Keats or Byron or Shelley, he would have been remembered, like them, as a visionary, radical, even a dangerous poet. Instead, when we think of Alfred Tennyson, and let's face it, who doesn't think of Alfred Tennyson? Many of us think of a somewhat crusty Victorian, bearded, caped, cheering on Britain's armies as they charge into territories that they shouldn't be anywhere near, stormed at by shot and shell, in short. On such occasions, we think of Alfred Lord Tennyson, who was the poet laureate for almost 40 years, which is 35 years longer, which is 35 years longer at least than anyone should be poet laureate for. But the young Tennyson was a very different kettle of fish. He was not a national treasure. And in his masterful recent book, The Boundless Deep, the great biographer Richard Holmes has recast Tennyson in a new light. He has revealed him to be a deeply radical thinker, breaking new ground in science as well as poetry. Part of the young Tennyson's brilliance was the way that he reinvented ancient myths and stories to encompass modern ideas, and also to encompass his own violently fluctuating mental state. Over the course of his life, he would produce a long Arthurian epic that repopularized the legends of King Arthur. He'd write a number of poems that were set in the Homeric world of the Odyssey. These include Tiresias, who is a long-time friend of the show. Actually, is
I
it
think he's a
Tiresias?
recent
It's
he's a recent friend of the show.
Yeah, but I don't think he does have a Tiresias. I think it's only Tithonus.
No, no, he's got Tiresias.
Oh, is he? Okay. These include a Tiresias, who's a friend of the show. Jonty said before the recording that he's a short-term friend of the show. the Lotus-Eaters, and then the subject of this episode, Ulysses. And I'd want to add Tithonus to that, who has a bit
Mm.
part in the Odyssey itself.
Now, if you're wondering who the hell is Ulysses, fear not. He is simply Odysseus, but with his name Latinized and reduced by one syllable. Ulysses is to classicists what the word Straya is to Australians.
Nice,
Um,
nice comparison. Lovely.
Although it's even better because, Straya is only two syllables. You can say Straya mate and still have one syllable up your sleeve.
I think
Uh,
what you're trying to say, Jonty, is that Tennyson, like Australians, enjoyed metrical flexibility.
He did. Ulysses takes the form of a dramatic monologue in blank verse in which the aging Ulysses, long after the events of the Odyssey, prepares to leave Ithaca for one last voyage into the unknown. Its famous last line, which everyone should know off by heart by now, because Sophie has paraphrased it about 17 times already in this episode. Its famous last line, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield, inspired Victorians. And it inspires us too, Sophie. This is one of
Sure
those
does.
texts we cover that we have zero reservations about. We love this poem. And we
Do we
stand with
ever?
Prime Minister Robert Peel, who, when he first heard the poem, said that he recognised a good speech when he heard one and awarded Tennyson a much needed government pension on the spot. Tennyson himself said that there is more about myself in Ulysses, which was written under the sense of loss and that all had gone by, but that still life must be fought out to the end. In this episode, we're going to show what Tennyson meant by these gnomic words, how he turned to the classics to produce new art, and why Ulysses, wherever he is, hopefully in the Happy Isles with his friend Achilles, is still a source of inspiration to us today.
Very nice. Lovely use of the word gnomic, Jonty. Gnomes have been much on my mind because in an attempt to crack the code of Shakespeare for our kids, we watched Gnomeo and Juliet on the weekend. Maybe there could be a third movie in the franchise about the gnomic Tennyson.
Yes. Sophie, take us through the synopsis.
Yes. Well, it's a barn burner, as you'd expect, of a poem called Ulysses. It's set several years after the events of the Odyssey. In some ways, that's the sort of genius move of Tennyson, is to kick things off after the whole thing's finished. Ulysses has survived the Cyclops and the Sirens. He's steered his ship between Scylla and Charybdis and done all the things that we spoke about at length with the world's favourite classicist, Mary Beard, on our episode with her. He's returned to Ithaca. He's slaughtered 108 nasty suitors. He's made triumphant and vigorous love to his wife, Penelope. And now, just a few years later, he is, quite frankly, bored out of his skull. One imagines, though it's not detailed in the poem, that Penelope might have been feeling the same way. So what does Ulysses do? He ceremonially hands his scepter to his son Telemachus, who we've seen much of already in the Odyssey. And we hope that he's going to be up to the job. I think Telemachus is going to do a good job. He's a made ruler. He summons.
That's a lovely vote of confidence, Sophie.
Yeah, I'm Team Telemachus in many ways.
Yeah.
Ulysses, however, summons his mariners, those souls that have toiled with him, as he puts it, conveniently forgetting that when he returned to Ithaca, he had managed to lose them all in the journey home. He must have recruited some new ones, I think. He says he doesn't know where they're heading, but perhaps they may reach the Happy Isles, which are where heroes go where they die and meet the great Achilles once again. And in fact, before we completely reduce this masterpiece to prosaic guff, let's let Tennyson himself lead us out by segueing from our dreary synopsis to the final 25 lines of this extraordinary poem. Jonty, we better have it in your voice. I think it's the closest we've got to Tennyson himself.
So here's the last section where Odysseus, having handed on power to his son, turns to his ship in the waiting down in the harbour. There lies the port. The vessel puffs her sails. There gloom the dark broad seas. My mariners, souls that have toiled and wrought and fought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine and opposed free hearts, free foreheads, you and I are old. Old age hath yet his honour and his toil. Death closes all, but something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done. not unbecoming men that strove with gods. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks, the long day wanes, the slow moon climbs, the deep moans round with many voices. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off and sitting well in order smite the surrounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield.
Beautifully done. Really
I find
beautiful.
it unbelievably moving, that passage, and I think it's as good as anything Shakespeare wrote. I think that's
Mm,
the power of Tennyson's dramatic monologues, these monologues he does. That when
mm.
he's in full cry, he matches Shakespeare,
Oh, he's
and
amazing.
I don't think Shakespeare could have written a better speech than that.
I completely agree with you. I love Tennyson actually. It's not fashionable to love Tennyson, or
No,
maybe it is again, but it wasn't when I was being educated. But I've always absolutely loved Tennyson. I can never hear that speech, Jonty, without thinking of the film Dead Poets Society, the Peter Weir film, which was one of the great anthems of intellectual anthems of my youth. And that speech is read at the inception of the society by Robert Sean Leonard, himself a somewhat doomed figure in the film, and it's curiously appropriate to the poem itself. That the reading that I best remember would be this young hot actor at the dawn of his great career, lisping it in his youthful sibilant voice, soon to be extinguished by the flame of his own ambition in the film.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Sophie, because, and I'm not even sure you're aware, this is a spontaneous
A
revelation, but
fusion,
our
yeah.
our beloved Red Room Poetry, the organisation
Mm,
which I work for, and you're on the board, we are
mm.
doing an event in early September, which is Peter Weir in conversation with our artistic director, David Stavanger, introducing Dead Poet Society at Sydney Opera House. So
Good God.
anyone listening who's going to be in Sydney, get tickets.
Oh my goodness, can't
It's going
wait.
to do
Can I
everything
come?
Sophie said. Yes, of course, you're on the
When is
board.
it? When is it?
Oh my God, have we just revealed a conflict of interest? No, you can't come, Sophie. You must wait in line like anyone else. Beginning of
Um,
September.
oh, can't wait. So we've set things up for this poem in all its majesty and magnificence. But what I think is really interesting about Tennyson, Jonty, is that he does not start, as you pointed out, in majesty and magnificence. He has almost no facial hair whatsoever.
None.
Instead, he's born in modest and somewhat traumatized circumstances in Lincolnshire, isn't he?
That's right.
In
His fa
1809,
uh,
in the sort of in the high watermark of the Romantic period, when Wordsworth and Coleridge are still going strong, and Keats is barely
out of
he
his
doesn't
nappies.
yeah
Keats is still
he
in his
doesn't have any
nappies.
facial hair either when this
No,
is all happening.
no.
So it's I mean that's a really interesting thing, isn't it? That Keats and Tennyson are sort of contemporaries.
Almost, yes.
Yeah,
I mean,
even though
well,
we
yeah.
think of Tennyson as being a much later poet. So tell us about Tennyson's early years.
Well, he comes from his father. His grandfather was a self-made man who had
Mm,
made quite a bit of money and had dreams of building a new aristocratic family. But he decided his eldest son, which was Alfred Tennyson's father, was too wayward and hopeless and disinherited him. And so
oof.
Tennyson's father, George Tennyson,
Mm.
um, uh, uh, was he a farmer, by the way? Do you know?
I thought he was a clergyman. Yeah,
So
he's a
Tennyson's
rector.
father, George Tennyson, became the rector in a village in Lincolnshire, and was this very bitter alcoholic character. He and his wife gave birth to many children. Tennyson had seven brothers and four sisters, and the entire family was filled with what Tennyson called this black blood, this
Mm.
depressive genetic streak. And there's so much kind of terrible mental illness in the
Oh my
family,
God, there
not
certainly
least
is.
in Tennyson's father himself. But of his siblings, of Tennyson's brothers, one of whom became an alcoholic, one became an opium addict, another ended up in a asylum. A lot of them came to early deaths. It was this kind of terrifying household of mental illness and alcoholism, and that sort of shadow haunts Tennyson through his life.
Mm.
He's terrified of going mad. He suffers from these terrible bouts of depression. He has this great fear that he's epileptic. Epilepsy also runs in the family, and there was huge stigma about epilepsy at the time. And Tennyson, right up until his 40s, used to go into these kind of auras or trances. So he's fascinated in the idea of the trance in
Mm.
romantic poetry and Coleridge and Keats because he relates it to these experiences he has. But I think it's fair to say that his life, his childhood in particular, is filled with this kind of brooding gloom of the household and
Yeah.
his own fear of madness and depression.
Oh my God, it's completely appalling. I mean, it's sort of, and I'm not the first person to have said this. A number of writers have made this comparison. It's like the Bronte household up in Yorkshire, where they're sort of in this isolated house with a clergyman father. In their case, it was their brother who was the real nightmare of the piece. But it's kind of on speed because there are so many more children involved, so many more minds to go off the rails. And Tennyson said about his youth, he said, in youth, I knew much greater unhappiness than I have known in later life. When I was about 20, I used to feel moods of misery unutterable. I remember once in London the realization coming over me of the whole of its inhabitants lying horizontal 100 years hence. The smallness and emptiness of life sometimes overwhelmed me. I find that such a powerful statement, actually, about all of London being just wiped out in the course
Yeah,
of 100 years. It really interestingly taps into sort of the other part of Tennyson's young life and his intellectual awakening, which is his becoming aware of all these things that were happening in what we would now call Victorian science, including
yeah,
the discovery or the unveiling of deep time, of this
yeah,
idea that a human lifespan was nothing compared to the kind of lifespans that geologic time we're dealing with. But I think we're getting a tiny bit ahead of ourselves because I think we could color in a tiny little bit more of the drama of life at the Summersby Rectory before we move on to Tennyson's interest in science, which is in so many ways equally interesting. So the father, who was a raging alcoholic and very, very violent, often threatened to kill the kids, particularly Frederick, who was one of Tennyson's older brothers. Apparently, one time he threatened it while holding both a knife and a loaded gun. And they kind of chased each other around the house. And this was a frequent occurrence. It wasn't sort of a one-off. The other kind of interesting detail that we know about how Tennyson sort of dealt with the trauma of his childhood home was that he developed a fascination in what we would now call the mythic past. So he said, before I could read, I was in the habit on a stormy day of spreading my arms to the wind and crying out, I hear a voice that's speaking in the wind. And the words far, far away always had a strange charm for me. And this sort of early impetus in Tennyson to flee the trauma of his home and find a kind of consolation in something mythic far, far away really ends up, I think, defining his poetic voice. Obviously in Ulysses, but in so many of his poems, he's playing with this idea of a setting for a poem that is another time completely, but it's also the time we're in right now. I think that's actually what makes the end of Ulysses so extraordinarily
yeah.
moving is the way it's managing multiple timescales.
So he went to Cambridge. He went to study at Trinity College, Cambridge, and it was a
Yeah.
complete breath of fresh air for him. He suddenly emerged from the gloom of his childhood, went to Cambridge, and found himself amongst smart, amusing, clever young men. And it was an absolute eye opener for him. And he
Mm.
also discovered he wasn't the sort of horrible, unlovable creature that his father would have him to be. He discovered he's sort of tall and rather handsome. People are drawn to him. So
Mm.
he has a delightful experience at Cambridge, and he makes two best friends who are going to be very, very important in his life, and in fact, in British culture generally.
Yeah.
One of which is Edward Fitzgerald, and Edward Fitzgerald would in later years translate the Rubaiyat of Omar,
Mm.
the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, which is this great moment where a kind of Eastern Islamic text is translated into English and becomes a Victorian blockbuster.
Yeah.
And Tennyson dedicated sort of many of his poems later on to Fitzgerald and their
Mm.
friendship.
Mm.
And the other all-important friend is Arthur Hallam. Now, remember this name because Arthur Hallam is going to come to a sticky end quite soon and lead
Yeah.
directly to Ulysses. And Arthur Hallam is the most important person in Tennyson's life. Arguably, he was in love with him, and certainly he never recovered from his death when it happened. They were both young poets. They dreamed of being Wordsworth and Coleridge together. They were obsessed
Mm.
by the lyrical ballads, and they set out, still aged about 20, to write a joint collection of poems inspired by Wordsworth and
Yeah.
Coleridge's.
Which I think Arthur Hallam's father actually put the brakes on. For
He
some
put a
reason,
kibosh
he was
to.
completely appalled by the idea. I think he was quite snobbish, and he thought that
He
Tennyson
was.
wasn't up to the
And
mark.
no, well, no, it was more that Arthur Hallam had gone to Eton, and unlike Wordsworth and Coleridge, and Arthur Hallam's father had more serious intentions for
Right.
his son than writing romantic poetry. And there were some rather lewd suggestions in Arthur Hallam's poems. And his
Yes.
father said, "There's absolutely no way you're publishing this." And Arthur
Yeah.
Hallam acquiesced. So, he
Exactly.
wasn't exactly Coleridge in the end. And then
Yeah.
Tennyson won the Cambridge Poetry Competition. This is his
Yeah.
first moment of fame. There was a Cambridge Poetry Competition in which a theme was given each year, and students would write poems in response. And the theme of 1830,
It's
when
very great.
Tennyson applied for it, was Timbuktu. I love this kind
Me too.
of imperial sort of, taking the name of a city somewhere in Africa and telling a whole bunch of sort of young Cambridge men, write a poem about Timbuktu. And Tennyson wrote an absolute barnstormer, not one that
Mm.
anyone would read today, but in the spirit of the time, a barnstormer. And he won the Cambridge
The
poetry
Chancellor's
competition.
Gold Medal.
Mm,
Yeah. Well done, Tennyson. And Hallam entered too, of course, with his own offering on Timbuktu, but he did not win. Although Hallam won another prize, so it was all very sort of even-handed and fair. Tennyson was also elected a member of the Cambridge Apostles, which many
yes.
people will have heard of. That was a debating society, but it was sort of debating plus. It was kind of a society of fellows in a way, and a place where young men, brilliant young men, met and had sparkling conversation and you know and and sparred with one another in these debates. And so there are lots of names who were also members of the apostles who we don't know now, but they at the time they were important. They were important young men. They were people from the great schools and the great families, the great minds of Cambridge in the 1820s, and Tennyson was among them. So this is the moment where he really starts to sort of get a sense of himself as being a real talent. So Arthur Hallam, was such an intimate friend of Tennyson's that Tennyson actually took the step of taking him home to the rectory in Lincolnshire. And I think Hallam was possibly Tennyson's only sort of non-local friend who was ever allowed to darken the door of the rectory before his father died. Tennyson, spoiler alert, Tennyson's father would actually meet his end quite soon. But while his father was still alive, Hallam came for a Christmas holiday at their place. And Tennyson then went to the Pyrenees with Hallam, which is very nice. Um, and the point of the story is that Hallam met Tennyson's sister Emily, and he fell in love with her. And there's much evidence that that they were really in love with one another. Eventually, sorry, the engagement was announced formally, and actually Hallam's family recognized it, even though they were
Yeah.
appalled by Hallam's low rent choice.
Yes. And Hallam and Tennyson, you mentioned the Pyrenees. They had the best gap year ever.
Yeah.
Like, we're a big fan of Agapia on this
Yeah.
show, and boy, oh boy, they had a great one. So, as you say, they went off on a tour of Europe, heading to the Pyrenees. Now, the reason why they went to the Pyrenees is they had got involved. This is an amazing detail. They had got involved in sort of radical causes in London, and this
Like
is not
Coleridge.
something
They're
like
really
Coleridge.
modelling themselves on romantic poets, these guys.
And this is something we do not associate Tennyson with at all, but they were asked to take some money and documents to the Spanish resistance movement. And that's why they had to go to the Pyrenees, which is the mountain range in between France and Spain, to hand over this much needed funding and
Yeah.
documents to the Spanish resistance movement, the rebels who were fighting Spanish tyranny, which they did. So that's pretty ballsy.
Really
And
ballsy.
then on the way back, they arrived back in Liverpool by boat. And as they arrived back in Liverpool by complete chance, they happen upon the opening of the first ever railway line. So the first ever railway line opens in 1830, public line. It only runs for a few miles, and it goes from Liverpool to just outside Liverpool. And they end up there as this historic moment occurs. And the MP who had gone up to cut the ribbon, a man called William Huskisson, he cut the ribbon and then was run over by the train and died, which is
incredibly unfortunate.
Which is incredibly unfortunate. But I love the fact that Tennyson is there at the moment of the founding of the railway. He's there at the first public railway ride. So I mean, it's hard to beat that as a gap year, although we've had some pretty close efforts on this show, haven't we?
Yeah, I feel like when people really put their mind to it, you can have a great gap year. Especially if you're going to become one of the greatest authors of all time. You know, those guys know how to have a gap year. So, I mean, I don't want to overclaim this, but it's certainly the case that Tennyson's lifetime coincided with quite a lot of firsts. I mean, there were a lot of things happening that hadn't happened before when he was a young man. There was the railway, there was the discovery of deep time and sort of geological layering and the geological history of the Earth. There were a lot of astronomical discoveries in the period. We'll talk about these. But one of the things that I suppose is coming out in this way we're introducing Tennyson is that he to some extent unknowingly, but in many ways knowingly, is really straddling the fault line between Romanticism and Victorianism. He has been brought up in this romantic kind of intellectual idiom. His sense of what it means to be creative and poetic and radical is informed by Coleridge and Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley and those guys, Byron. But he's living at the dawn of the Victorian era in terms of scientific knowledge and technological changes. And that tension, I think, is really going to shape Tennyson's work, including Ulysses. So he actually gets his first book of poems out the door pretty early on.
Sophie, if anyone's interested in this, we highly recommend Richard Holmes's recent book, The Boundless Deep, which is Richard Holmes is one of the great biographers, particularly of the Romantic poets. And his most recent book, which is less than a year old, is a book about the young Tennyson. And he actually stops the book as Tennyson writes Charge of the Light Brigade. It's all about the early years.
Yeah.
And Holmes sort of dissects the scientific innovations that were happening at the time and showing how deeply engaged Tennyson was with them. So Holmes says there are three. There's kind of new science books emerging, which are pushing the idea of biological evolution. Evolution, which we take for granted now, but most people know was a very controversial idea in the 19th century. The idea that human beings hadn't just come into the world like Adam and Eve 8,000 years ago, but it had evolved over many tens of thousands, nay, millions of years, was a deeply destabilizing thought. Yeah. Charles Darwin was born the same year, 1809.
So we're still pre-Darwinian at this moment, but there are people who are pushing toward evolution as an idea.
And not least Tennyson, not
Yeah.
least Tennyson himself, through his poems of the 1840s. I mean, this is a bit later. He's starting to reflect ideas of evolution in his own way, although it's not Darwin's concept of natural selection.
Yeah.
And this idea of evolution is tied to what you referred to earlier, this idea of deep time. And we talked in our Bleak House episode about the discovery of dinosaurs that was going on, and this
Mm.
sense that millions of years ago, before humanity had evolved, there was this whole species of giant lizards, was again completely destabilizing and terrifying. And it was a reminder to everyone that it could happen to us. It could happen to human beings. We too could
Extinction.
go. We could go extinct. So
Yeah.
that's also running. And Tennyson, the young, moody, depressive Tennyson, finds these ideas completely terrifying and also compelling. He can't stop fidgeting with them. And
Totally.
his study plan at university, you know, was the one would imagine the study plan of a young student interested in poetry being, you know,
Mm.
studying Greek and Latin and studying poetry. He created a study plan that was built around science, so
Yeah.
and languages. So he focused on history on Mondays. On Tuesday, he focused on chemistry. On Wednesday, botany. Electricity on Thursday. Animal
Cool.
physiology on Friday. Mechanics on Saturday. And then on Sunday would study theology. So he's really
Makes you
dedicating
think.
himself to science and these scientific innovations which are
Yeah.
capturing everyone's imagination.
It's totally fascinating. And his tutor at Cambridge is not a poet or a, what we would think of as a kind of literature don, or literature fellow. His tutor was a man named William Whewell. I think is probably how you say it, who was the professor of mineralogy, which of course was already in and of itself a kind of innovative and groundbreaking new field. And his scientific research, Whewell's scientific research, helped bridge a gap between a sort of empirical observation of the world of geology and mineralogy and what had previously been philosophical theories or speculative ideas about the origins of the earth. And then the other big publication that happens around the same time is Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, which is a 3-volumer. It's his theory of extinction and geologic time that really puts the cat among the pigeons of sort of traditional Christian theology and creation stories. The last thing I suppose to say about Tennyson's early education in terms of his being a real polymath is that although his father was a violent, homicidal alcoholic, he was also a great scholar, and he tutored his kids in Latin and Greek, in philosophy, in botany and physics. So Tennyson grew up in this household where this kind of polymathic, multidisciplinary education was really prized. So, for example, he knew Latin and Greek really well. He knew Horace from memory and other classical writers as well. But he also knew how to use a microscope to examine plants and insects. And he had a telescope, and he was looking at the heavens through his
Yes.
telescope. So, not only does he know lots of things, but he's also working with this idea that all forms of knowledge are interconnected and interdependent.
Yeah. So in 1832, the young Tennyson, 23 years old, publishes his first kind of major collection of poetry. He's actually published a few shorter volumes. And this collection brings together the best poems of his younger years,
Yeah.
as well as a lot of others. But there are some real barnstormers
Yeah,
in
there's some
there.
really good
It
ones.
includes The Kraken, which is one of the great sonnets in the
Yeah.
English language. It includes Mariana.
Which I love, actually.
I love Mariana.
I was taught Mariana by one of the great Tennyson scholars of the world, Professor Isabel Armstrong. If anyone knows Isabel Armstrong and is listening to this podcast, I just want to do a formal shout out to her incomparable greatness as a reader of Victorian poetry.
It included the poem that I've misspelt in my notes as the Lady of Shallots. I'm imagining
We're
a
using a
sort
bit
of
of Asian cookery, a
I'm
fusion fry-up.
imagining a kitchen scullion, the Lady of Shalott, and it includes the one which I want to mention because it is the Odyssean one, which
Yeah.
is the Lotus-Eaters. But the quality he gets in these early poems, the best ones, the ones that I've mentioned, they're very influenced by Keats, and the way that Keats in the great odes like To Autumn and Ode on the Grecian Urn creates this kind of sensual, timeless, poetic landscape, and that's what these poems lean into. He was really obsessed by Keats, and these
Yeah.
poems are filled with this sensuality, but also this kind of stasis that spoke to his own depression, this
Mm.
sense of being stuck. And I think the best of this first collection is the Lotus-Eaters. Now,
Mm.
in the Odyssey, the island of the Lotus-Eaters is a land where Odysseus and his crew stop, and it's full of this lotus plant, which is basically opium, and they
Mm.
consume the opium. And when you've consumed it, you lose all ambition. Any of that desire to strive and seek and find and yield evaporates, and you just sit around in
Well,
this
you're
kind
up
of
for
opiate.
yielding, but the rest of it you're not into.
You end up in this opiate sensual stupor. And he wrote the first part of the poem during the Garpiar, the best Garpiar ever, with Arthur Hallam. They were in the
Mm.
Pyrenees, and he was looking at the landscape and some waterfalls, and that prompted the descriptions of the land of the Lotus-Eaters. And the poem begins with Odysseus saying, "Courage," he said, and pointed toward the land. "This mounting wave will roll us shoreward soon." And then in the afternoon, they came unto a land in which it seemed always afternoon. And we begin with Odysseus as this heroic, striving figure, and then his men slump into this trance, this opiate trance.
Mm.
And then the second half of the poem is it's called the
It's kind of
choric
like
song.
passive smoking, actually. That's how the mechanism works. You don't even have
Yes,
to eat it. It says, "All round the coast the languid air did swoon, breathing like one that hath a weary dream. Full faced above the valley stood the moon, and like a downward smoke the slender stream along the cliff to fall and pause and fall did seem." He's a really good poet, Tennyson.
he's an incredible poet. He does a sort of a deliberate shout out to Keats to acknowledge the influence.
Yep.
And by this point, Keats's reputation after his death had grown, but he was still not a household name by any means. And there's a line here in the Lotus-Eaters where he says, "Lo, sweetened with the summer light, the full juiced apple waxing over mellow drops in a silent autumn night." So that's the
Boom.
first
Smoking
two
quill.
lines of Ode to Autumn there.
Yeah.
And then he sets up a formula which he's going to revisit later in Ulysses with that wonderful final line where he
Mm.
talks about the apple, or a flower ripening in the place of the apple. It ripens and
Mm.
fades and falls and hath no toil. It's that kind of language
Yeah.
of to strive and seek and find, and not
Yeah.
to yield.
Yeah,
Um,
super fascinating.
and then what I think is so formally brilliant is that the poem, as it goes on, the lines get longer and longer as these mariners, these kind of lotus drunk mariners, slip into a sensual wallowing in their own language, and they can no
Mm.
longer bring the lines in shorter, the syllables get longer. And it ends on this vision of deep time, essentially, this idea we were just talking about, where the mariners, who at first have just been feeling high and
Mm.
observing the landscape around them, now pull out and start to and say, we're sitting here on this hillside above the gods, even because the gods are so preoccupied in the fate of men, and we're not
Mm.
interested in either men or the gods. We're above them, and they suddenly talk about humanity and the cycle of humanity as being a passing blink. So
Mm.
yeah, it ends on this note of both deep time and extinction. They say that like a tale of little meaning, though the words are strong, chanted from an ill-used race of men that cleave the soil, sow the seed, and reap the harvest with enduring toil, storing yearly little dews of wheat and wine and oil, till they perish and they suffer some. Um, so it's just all,
Mm.
all of human history is now just parceled up into this kind of meaningless blip.
Isn't it totally fascinating? And it's so interesting, your point about the poem kind of formally collapsing. I mean, purposefully formally collapsing, which is very un-Keatsian, actually. So in that sense, he's taking us out of Keats land and pushing us more into T.S. Eliot land. And Eliot, incidentally, really liked Tennyson. He loved Ulysses, and he liked the Lotus-Eaters too. But the opening of the poem of the Lotus-Eaters is very formal and very rhymey. So I want to make a point about that, because it's courage, he said, and pointed toward the land. The mounting wave will roll us shoreward soon. In the afternoon, they came unto a land in which it seemed always afternoon, which is quite trippy troppy. It's quite sort of ballad like and highly rhythmic. It almost reminds me of like Lewis Carroll and Edward Lear in the way it's kind of using rhyme to depict this fantastical land. And Tennyson actually knew Edward Lear, which is sort of interesting. Edward Lear was a great fan of Tennyson's wife. He said, "I should think, computing moderately, that 15 angels, several hundreds of ordinary women, many philosophers, a heap of truly wise and kind mothers, 3 or 4 minor prophets, and a lot of doctors and schoolmistresses might all be boiled down, and yet their combined essence fall short of what Emily Tennyson really is." So obviously the Tennyson family in general had a big impact on the young Edward Lear. Tennyson is really on sort of the Keats program here, because the collection is praised by some but dumped on by many. In a conservative magazine called the Quarterly Review, someone called J.W. Croker, I feel like he kind of comes off second in this, said that it was dreamy, and he described Tennyson as part of a Milky Way, i.e. milksoppy, Milky Way of weak poets. And he was obviously thinking about Keats, because it was actually Keats's Endymion that this same critic, Croker, had dumped on about 15 years earlier. But others really, really loved the collection.
Well, hang on, Sophie. I mean, we should just hover on that for a moment. I mean, it is extraordinary. In our Keats episode, we talked about the review that Byron said snuffed Keats out in one go. The review that was so devastating. This lampooning of Keats, as this sort of Cockney upstart who had apparently given up his career in medicine to go and be a poet, and ended with get back to the what was it, the shop, the dispensary.
Oh, the dispensary. It was sort of
it ended with get back to the dispensary, Keats. It's the same guy who then 14 years later tears apart Tennyson, and Tennyson is so destroyed by this, like Keats, that he doesn't publish it. He doesn't publish for 10 years. Exactly.
No,
its history repeats itself. And the thing about Crocker is that his reviews are completely brilliant. They're wrong. But I was reading the review last night, and I read the Keats one again. And as pieces of journalism, they are fantastic, but they are so vitriolic. He's got that kind of power for vitriol, like A.A. Gill used to have, or something, that you can see how these poets cannot recover from them. And in this one on Tennyson, he frames it all as if he's writing as if he's celebrating the emergence of a new genius. And you can imagine poor Tennyson starting it and thinking, oh, goody, this is going to end well. And then it just slips into parody and just tears him apart over great length. So Crocker's got a lot to answer for in many ways.
He came up with these great phrases like the Milky Way of poets and the Cockney poets. I mean, he coined these expressions that stuck. But someone who did not hate the collection was Arthur Hallam, and he wrote a review of it in the Englishman's magazine. The review is called "On Some of the Characteristics of Modern Poetry and on the Lyrical Poems of Alfred Tennyson." Now, he didn't have any qualms about lavishly praising his friend without mentioning that they knew each other, which is really, really, really nice, because one of the things that Hallam does in this review is put his finger, I think incredibly accurately, I want to read a bit of it, on what it was about Tennyson that was really pushing poetry forward. That Tennyson, yes, he was influenced by Keats and the Romantics, but he was doing really new things. And this is what Hallam says are the characteristics of Tennyson's writing that make it so good. First, his luxuriance of imagination, and at the same time his control over it, which is true. Secondly, his power of embodying himself in ideal characters, or rather moods of character, with such extreme accuracy of adjustment that the circumstances of the narration seem to have a natural correspondence with the predominant feeling. So he's sort of anticipating T.S. Eliot's demand for, what's it called? For an objective correlative there, actually. And as it were, to be evolved. Thirdly, his vivid, picturesque delineation of objects and the peculiar skill with which he holds all of them fused, to borrow a metaphor from science, in a medium of strong emotion. Fourthly, the variety of his lyrical measures, so the way he mixes up his meters, and exquisite modulation of harmonious words and cadences. Fifthly, the elevated habits of thought implied in these compositions and imparting a mellow soberness of tone, more impressive to our minds than if the author had drawn up a set of opinions in verse, and sought to instruct the understanding rather than to communicate the love of beauty to the heart. It's a really good piece of criticism.
It
So this is
is.
sort of setting Tennyson up for, what is going to be very distinct about his voice. And just to kind of round out the Tennyson-Keats comparison, it's true that their first publications, both of those poets, have a great deal in common. And it's really interesting, I think, that Tennyson, like Keats, has this sense of someone who is doomed, someone who's going to die young. He's got this feeling of being cut off in his prime, just as Keats did. Now, in Keats's case, it was because his whole family had died of tuberculosis, and he suspected that he was going to go the same way. In Tennyson's case, I think it's a symptom of his violent, traumatic childhood. But it's also very, very interesting and sad that the version that young death would take for Tennyson would be the death of Hallam, because,
Yes.
it's the same as Keats's death. It's got that same impact on his poetry. But unlike Keats, he's not dead. He's going to live for another 50 years writing poems. So it's sort of the Keatsian thing, the Keats comparison, it's more than just a kind of coincidence or a kind of stylistic comparison. There's something about those writers who are really driven by this youthful sense of being on the brink of extinction.
Yes, and it's deliberate. Tennyson is deeply inspired by Keats.
Yeah.
But here's what happens to Hallam in that same year that he's written his review. In September 1833, he goes with his father. He accompanies his father on a trip to Europe, and while in Vienna, becomes very, very ill and then dies quite suddenly of a stroke. So it's
Mm.
a very kind of rare, unlikely thing. By that point,
Mm.
as you said, he's engaged to Tennyson's sister, and the news comes back that he has died, and Tennyson is completely destroyed by this news. I mean, it's hard to put into words how devastated he is. It's like it's not that he's lost a friend, he's lost a soulmate. Even say he's lost a lover doesn't quite
Mm.
do it justice. The extent to which this derails him,
Yeah.
and it
It's a sort of
results.
Heathcliff Cathy job. He's lost himself.
He has lost himself, and it results very quickly in this pouring out of lyrics and poems in which he's basically trying to write his way away from suicide.
Yeah.
And within a few weeks, he sits down and writes Ulysses. And
Mm.
Ulysses is the the fighting poem, and I think is the reason why it's so loved. But at the same time, he writes a very long poem called Two Voices that was very problematic at the time because it's about suicide. It's about the
Mm.
two voices in his head, one of which is urging him to suicide, and the other is urging him to live. And it ends as so many of these poems of the kind of pre 20th century, which are about profound spiritual or existential despair. It ends
Mm.
on a rather sort of glib turning to God, and
Yeah.
yet and yet the God bit is the bit that feels very unfelt, and what we're left with actually is this kind of deep despair and the pull of suicide towards him. And there's a line in Two Voices which it's important to read because it is the line that becomes the last line of Ulysses. It's exactly the same thought, but here it is framed as a reason not to live any longer. And in Ulysses, he makes it a reason to keep living. And
Mm.
he says in Two Voices, "'Twere better not to breathe or speak than cry for strength, remaining weak and seem to find, but still to seek." So there he's saying in
Mm.
Two Voices that that seeking, that striving, that finding is futile. There's no rest to it, and it's better just
Mm.
to end things now. And of course, beautifully in Ulysses, that thought, which is the most negative moment in Two Voices, he works through to find a way of reframing it as a positive quality, and that's part of the power of Ulysses.
That's
But he also
beautiful. I
writes
love
at
that.
this time. He writes Break, Break, Break,
It's a goodie.
another great lyric of grief. He writes the astonishing Death of Arthur, the Mort d'Arthur, which
Yes.
he later builds out. I mean, he spends the next 40 years expanding out from this passage he's written of the death of Arthur into a vast Arthurian epic. But
Mm.
actually, nothing in it is really as good as this moment where Arthur and Sir Bedivere are on the kind of shores of the lake. Arthur is dying, and Sir
Mm.
Bedivere, who is the Tennyson character, says, "How am I going to live without you?" And Arthur, or who's very clearly Arthur Hallam, of course,
Yeah.
says, you need to move on. You need to find a way to move on. It's
Yeah.
also incredibly moving, just if you read it in its own right, and even more so when you know the full story. And then secretly, Tennyson also is starting to write these elegies, which will finally be published 15 years later as in Memoriam, which is
Mm.
this not, I mean, it's the length of a novel. It's 133 elegies that he
Mm.
writes over, which are all about Arthur Hallam, that
Yeah.
he writes over 15 years. So he is completely destroyed by this development.
Mm.
He goes through a stage where he stands outside Arthur Hallam's house at nighttime, just
Yeah.
standing watch, and it raises the question, sort of, what's going on. What I mean, of one doesn't want to demean grief, but
Mm.
rarely has somebody felt something so strongly, I think, as
Yeah.
Tennyson has felt.
Yes, I was thinking about this too. It's in some ways it's sort of the great puzzle of Tennyson's life, isn't it? I mean, it certainly becomes the event around which his whole writing life gets organized. Um, and in that sense, I quite like my point that it's sort of like the energy that galvanizes Keats to write his odes. You know, Keats is kind of struggling as a poet. He then realizes, as we said in our episode on what was it, the Nightingale, as we said in our episode on the Nightingale, um, he's galvanized by the recognition that he's not just going to die; he's going to die soon, and it kind of pushes him into this sort of imaginative liberation. I suppose for Tennyson, Hallam's death does the same thing. It organizes him creatively. I think as a person who was raised in a household of pure terror and violence and loss, I think to then lose an adult friend in the way that Tennyson loses Hallam, I think that would be a really earth-shattering event. It's kind of, I mean, I almost want to make a glib comparison with the sort of Lyell, the geologic discovery that there had been extinction in
Yes,
in the in the form of the dinosaurs. It's a kind of personal discovery of the same idea that extinction is right there waiting for us. Um,
yes.
I think it's everything. You know, it's very complex. I mean, obviously the scholars have gone to town on the idea that they were lovers,
Well, it just seems too obvious and glib, and
right?
I think you're right. It's it's I think Arthur Hallam had been the sort of light at the end of this awful childhood. He went to university and met this like-minded soul. And of course it's happening at the same time as he's had this terrible review of his poetry. He's feeling that everything he does is futile. He's
Mm.
got this complete fear of insanity, which is always there as well, and he fears he's going to disappear into madness. So I think it's all these things, but you know, there is sort of nothing else like it in English literature. The
Yes.
depictions of grief, and that's why he becomes so famous, is because when
Yeah.
he publishes these poems and he publishes in Memoriam, he becomes the go-to poet for making sense of grief. I mean, the Victorians keep these poems in their front rooms or by their bedsides in order to deal with their own moments of grief and
Totally. I
loss.
mean, he
Like
literally becomes like the Bruce Springsteen of grief. I mean,
yeah,
he's the boss.
yes. Sophie, let's take a break and then come back and look at how all
How he
these
does it.
all these things and stories are kind of
I think
worked
the word
through
is
in this wonderful poem.
coalesce.
coalesced into this wonderful poem, Ulysses.
So, like Tennyson's Ulysses, we're coming a little belatedly to this poem. I feel like we did a lot of talking before we actually got to the poem itself. But I realized when we were preparing for this episode, it's so much more interesting as a poem when you understand all the things that are happening to
Yeah,
Tennyson, and actually in the Victorian world where he's writing it. Or in fact, it's pre-Victorian, isn't it? When does Victoria come to the throne? 1837.
yeah,
So it's actually not quite Victorian. So he writes it in 1833, in the immediate aftermath of Hallam's death. He doesn't publish it, though, until 1842, because, as you said, he gets so discouraged by the reviews of the 1832 poems that he kind of doesn't publish. But he drafts it immediately afterwards. And the other poem that he drafts in the immediate aftermath of Hallam's death is one of my favorite Tennyson poems, actually, Tithonus. And I'm not going to go into detail on it, but Tithonus is another dramatic monologue about another figure, actually, who gets a little bit part in the Odyssey, in Homer's Odyssey, Tithonus, who is a man who can't die. He ages and ages, but he can never die, and he watches time pass and the world change, and he is kind of trapped in immortality. Now, Tithonus is the poem that you would expect Tennyson to have written after Hallam's death, where he has this kind of nightmarescape of being caught in his own aliveness when Hallam has died. So the opening of Tithonus is the woods decay and fall, the vapors weep their burden to the ground. Man comes and tills the field and lies beneath, and after many a cruel summer dies the swan, me only cruel immortality consumes. So that's what you think he's going to write. And he does write it. He writes Tithonus, but he also writes Ulysses. And the thing I find so incredibly interesting about Ulysses is that he writes as an old man, but the energy is the energy of a young man.
yeah.
And the story is the exact reverse of what you'd expect. It's not a story of being reconciled to death. It's not really even a story of grief on the face of it. It's a story of restlessness, of an inability to reconcile oneself to sort of being home. It's in a way, it's an inability to reconcile himself to love and familiarity and domesticity.
And all these poems that he writes at the time, they all capture the fluctuating moods he has. And Tithonus, as you say, is one of the deep despairing ones, just like Two Voices that we talked about earlier, and also Break, Break, Break. But it's
Yeah.
Ulysses where he manages to turn all of this despair into a sense that life is a struggle, but there is hope to it. And I think that's what makes it such a powerful poem. So we should read by it. And I'm going to suggest, Sophie, actually, it's
Mm.
longish, but I think it's short enough that we could actually just work through it for the rest of this episode.
Yeah, I love that
Just
idea. Let's do it.
do it in chunks. One thing to say is that Tennyson is bringing to life something which is actually referred to in the Odyssey, and it is the idea that Odysseus will have further
Right.
adventures.
Yeah.
So there's a moment in the Odyssey where Circe, who we talked about a great deal last week, Circe has been holding Odysseus as her kind of sex slave. And eventually
Mm.
Odysseus says, "You really need to let me go. I need to get back home." And she says, "Okay, okay. But in order to do that, you need to go to the underworld and consult Tiresias. Tiresias is a dead prophet, and he will tell you what you need to do to get home." Now, one of the other poems that Tennyson writes at this time, along with Tithonus and Ulysses, is a brilliant poem about Tiresias. He does another dramatic monologue about Tiresias.
Mm.
And Tiresias's deal is that he observed Athena, the goddess. He spied on her while she was bathing, and is obviously being punished as a result. So
Yeah.
he's blinded, but he becomes a prophet. But like Cassandra, he has that dilemma that he has the power to foresee the future, but people rarely believe him. So Odysseus in the Odyssey goes to the underworld. He finds Tiresias, and Tiresias tells him two things. The first of which is, "Listen, mate, one of your next adventures is you're going to go to the island of the sun god. Now, whatever you do, don't eat the sun god's cattle, right? The cattle are for him to eat. You are
Yeah.
not to eat them. That's it. Now, unfortunately, we know from the very first page of the Odyssey, from the very first page of the Odyssey, that that what's going to happen is that Odysseus and his men, or his men, will eat the sun god of the cattle. One of the first things it said
That's the
is
first thing they do.
Odysseus.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just refers to Odysseus in this epithet and says his men will eat the cattle of the sun god. So the moment Tiresias says that, we're like, oh God, okay, this isn't going to go well.
Yeah.
And the second thing Tiresias says, and you can see why people don't listen to him much when he's prophesying, when he's giving prophecies, because he's a real downer of a guy.
Yeah.
And he says to
Massively.
Odysseus, the other thing I'm going to tell you is that you think you've got it bad at the moment. Well, you are eventually going to get home. And when you get home, that's not going to be it. You are going to go off on another adventure again at some point. And this adventure is going to be the reverse of the one you're doing now. This one is all at sea. This last adventure, you will travel inland to the furthest point inland you can get away from the sea. And that is going to be the focus of this adventure. And then that's all Tiresias says. And Odysseus is like, wow, that's a real bummer of the thought. I'm going to have to do all this over again, but inland. And so it's that moment which has always raised this question to readers of the Odyssey. So what is that adventure? Is there a whole other book that the
Right. Is
Homeric
there
poets
Odyssey
wrote?
2?
Yeah, that has been lost, and that's what Tennyson closes
Right.
on this poem.
Right.
He's setting up that adventure.
Yeah, this is Odyssey 2.
Yeah.
All right, so let's
Now, I
start.
can't work out, it's the fact I have a cold is making my reading this text more
Authentic.
powerful and dramatic, or if it's just horrible to listen to.
It's making it wonderfully musical,
Yeah,
but
I think you should read the first bit, Sophie. I'm not sure musical is the quality I'm looking for.
yeah, I don't think he's got a sinus infection when he says this. I
No,
don't think that's the issue.
I don't
Okay,
think
so
he'd be
here we go.
leaving home. I think he might say, I'm going to leave home and I leave
Yeah,
everything to Telemachus as soon as I get over this cold.
yeah, and then ask his wife to bring him his nasal spray. Okay,
Yeah.
which I highly recommend, by the way. It little profits that an idle king by this still hearth among these barren crags, matched with an aged wife, I meet and dole unequal laws unto a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. I cannot rest from travel. I will drink life to the lees. All times I have enjoyed greatly, have suffered greatly, both with those that loved me and alone, on shore, and when through scudding drifts the rainy Hyades vexed the dim Hyades, I think. Through scudding drifts the raining Hyades vexed the dim sea. I am become a name, for always roaming with a hungry heart. There's Springsteen. Much have I seen and known, cities of men and manners, climates, councils, governments, myself not least, but honoured of them all, and drunk delight of battle with my peers far on the ringing plains of windy Troy. I'm going to stop there because the next bit I think is a bit of a standalone. What's Ulysses getting at here? He's definitely down on his domestic life. He describes his wife as aged, which is a bit ungallant, frankly.
Unfair, since, yeah, I mean, he is too.
Yeah. And, old people are the new young people. Everyone's really into sort of late in the day romance. He could have really gone the other way with that. He describes his crags as barren and his hearth as still. So there's strong notes of failure to reproduce there, even though he's got Telemachus, his son. And he's describing the people who he governs, his subjects, as a savage race. And what they do is hoard, sleep, and feed. And he frankly is, I guess what he's saying is, it turns out that sort of a political sinecure is not the role for me.
Yeah, it's a totally boss move because the whole of the Odyssey is this desperate yearning by Odysseus to get home. And then the terrible sort of bloodbath that ensues when he does get home to reclaim his palace and his wife. And for thousands of years, people had read this poem and been filled with that yearning. And the idea or the assumption is that, at the end, it's happily ever after.
Yeah.
And what Tennyson is doing is taking the idea of homecoming, which has been so central to literature from the Odyssey on,
Mm.
and says the point isn't homecoming. Homecoming is not the goal. Homecoming is never enough. Home is not the destination. It's the seeking which is the
Yeah.
destination. So I mean, it's hard to kind of relive the power of this scene
Yeah.
now because it's an old poem and a familiar poem. But at the time, being read by people who studied the classics at school, starting with Odysseus, having done everything
Yeah.
in the Odyssey, having got what he wanted, and only to discover that it's not what he actually wanted, is a really bold move.
Yeah. And I guess what he says is, I love that bit where he says, I am become a name. So he's basically
Yeah,
saying, everyone's heard of me, no one knows who I am. For
yeah,
always roaming with a hungry heart, which is great. Is a great line. And there's lots of little allusions to other poets sprinkled in here. I think Drinking Life to the Lees takes us to Keats
of
and to
course.
Autumn, even though it's not exactly his phrase. Manners, climates, councils, governments is very Miltonic. I think we're in the world of Satan and the Parliament in Pandemonium, in Paradise Lost there. I think the ringing plains of windy Troy, we're sort of with Spenser and the Fairy Queen there. And he's trying to get beyond all of that. He's trying to get into a new kind of writing, a new kind of adventure, something that actually hasn't yet been written in poetry.
The other sort of writer who he's leaning to very strongly here is, of course, Shakespeare. And
Right. Yes,
this
that's
is a
true.
speech in blank verse. It's the
Right.
form of many of Shakespeare's speeches. He does a little reference to Hamlet in line 5, that line that hoard and sleep and feed and know not me. Connects with Hamlet's description, what is a man if his chief good and market of his time be but to sleep and feed,
Oh,
a
that's good.
beast no more. And of course, but it's not Hamlet, it's Prospero. And what we have
Yeah,
here
right.
is
From the
Prospero
Tempest.
breaking his staff and handing over power. And that, or King Lear, he set up.
Yeah.
It's a moment of power transition, and Ulysses is handing power down to his son. But I think what's really lovely is that in both the Tempest and in Lear, these are old men handing off power so they can, in Lear's words, crawl towards death.
Mm.
And Ulysses is handing off power because it's
He's got something better to
static.
do.
He's got something better
Yeah.
to do.
Yeah. So the thing I find completely fascinating, John T, and I hadn't really thought about seriously before this episode, even though I've loved this poem my whole life, really, is why is this the way that Tennyson jumps in thinking about the death of Hallam? So you'd expect him to be crawling toward death. You'd expect him to be in Lear mode, handing off power. If you're going to if you're going to inhabit the voice of an old man at the end of his career, when you've just lost your best friend, you expect him to be in the elegiac mode. But this is not an elegiac poem. It's actually chucking elegy out the door, including throwing the mode of elegy as a kind of poetry out the door. We did we must have done an elegy. What elegy did we do? Oh, Country Churchyard, the Grey elegy, and in that we said that writing elegy, memorializing the death, a great death, is a really important poetic mode. Tennyson's not doing that here. He's not burying anyone. He's not burying Ulysses. He's not burying Telemachus.
But importantly, he is in the other poems we've talked about, and
Yeah,
this collection of 1842, which makes him incredibly famous. When he
yeah,
finally publishes these poems, it makes him instantly famous.
yeah.
You could almost subtitle it aspects of grief, and he's in these poems. He's looking at different emotions and experiences he's gone through. And Ulysses, it's the poem that even it's the poem that captures that even in grief, even in the depths of grief, there's a kind
Mm,
of optimism or a sense of change which brings a certain excitement to it as
totally,
well. And the range
totally.
of emotions that he presents over these poems is incredibly psychologically astute. And because Ulysses is the one that kind of speaks to that um, excitement that comes from grief, that comes from change, it's what makes it so unique and so powerful. Like as you say, we are not in the world here of Lycidas, of John Milton's
Mm,
Lycidas, where John Milton is performing the grief he doesn't really feel for somebody he didn't know that well, and is
totally.
immediately and is going through the motions. Tennyson is somebody who is feeling every aspect of grief and very honestly acknowledging that even in the depths of despair, there are those moments where he's thinking, this could be a game changer for me. This could be the start of something new.
Yeah, I like that. Now, this takes us really perfectly into the next part of the poem. So, exactly what you said gets given voice in the next sort of verse paragraph. And this is how it goes. I am a part of all that I have met. Yet all experience is an arch where through gleams that untravelled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. How dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, not to shine in use, as though to breathe were life, life piled on life were all too little, and of one to me little remains. But every hour is saved from that eternal silence, there's Hamlet again, something more, a bringer of new things, and vile it were for some 3 suns to store and hoard myself, and this grey spirit yearning in desire to follow knowledge, like a sinking star beyond the utmost bound of human thought. This is a fabulously complex passage, and I think it's organized around this really intriguing definition of experience, where he says, yet all experience is an arch where through gleams that untravelled world whose margin fades forever and forever as I move. It's actually,
I
um,
I I got
yeah,
stuck on this last night, and I was looking forward to asking you what you make of it. There's something
um,
about this image. It's the bit I couldn't quite get in my head, and yet I felt its brilliance.
yeah,
That we're back in the world of sort of deep time or infinite experience here, and yet I couldn't
yeah.
quite get a handle on it as an image.
Yes. So I mentioned Isabel Armstrong, who taught me this poem, and when she taught it to us, she honed in on this passage, and she said, "What's it about?" For her, it was the key passage of the poem. And I suppose what's sort of epistemologically fascinating about it, experience in philosophy, when Tennyson's writing, experience is the gold of life, right? It's the thing you're supposed to have. It's knowledge of the world, knowledge of life that gives you a kind of security. It gives you the knowledge that it gives you judgment. It gives you the sort of the capacity to make good decisions, etc., etc. And Tennyson totally sets that aside. He basically sets a whole philosophic tradition aside, and he says experience is an arch. It's not a body of knowledge. It's a gateway. Because we have seen the world, that's how we know we haven't seen the world. It's sort of a fascinating paradox, where through gleams that untravelled world whose margin fades forever and forever when I move. He's basically saying we can't truly accumulate knowledge through experience, or through sort of experiential knowledge. All we know as humans is what we don't know,
Yeah.
is that there's this kind of disappearing horizon. And I sort of want to link it to the stuff with geology and science in the period. We didn't explicitly name check Herschel, the great astronomer, but both Lyell and the geologists, and Herschel and his work on astronomy and astronomical knowledge, it's all about disappearing horizons, isn't it? You think you're standing in a certain period of time. It turns out that that was completely false, and that it sort of gives way to an entirely new time horizon
Yeah.
of deep geologic time. You think you're in a universe which is bounded. It turns out that it's not at all. Boundless the
Yeah.
deep. That's why
It's the,
Holmes calls the
it's the
book
deep
that.
time. It's the deep time moment in this poem, and I
Yeah,
think it's so fascinating that one assumes that he is doing something very conventional in a way that here's a Victorian poem, here's a Victorian poet recreating a scene from Greek myth, and
yeah,
yet it's actually in every way very radical because it's
yeah,
not a scene in Greek myth. It's a scene
yeah,
that doesn't come down to us that he's
yeah.
leaning into. It totally dismisses the drive or yearning for homecoming that informs
Mm,
the Odyssey, And then and then in this image as well, he's bringing through a way of seeing experience of seeing time, which was not a common way of doing so at that time. The idea
Completely.
of I mean, the idea of sort of infinite expanses was there in a religious context. You could
Yeah.
have imagery of sort of deep space or sort of God's magnificence and infinitude, but the idea of that not having an organizing principle to it, that it is
Mm.
just kind of meaningless expanse, is the
Yeah.
new revelatory bit in this poem.
It's really fascinating. The last thing I think I'd really love to say is one writer who I love a great deal is the American transcendentalist, theologian, and essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson and Tennyson were in communication with one another, and they were writing around the same time. And just a couple of years after Tennyson publishes Ulysses, although it's a decade after he writes it, Emerson will write perhaps one of his very greatest essays, which is actually about the death of his son. It's called Experience, and it starts, where do we find ourselves? In a series of which we do not know the extremes and believe that it has none. We wake and find ourselves on a stair. There are stairs below us, which we seem to have ascended. There are stairs above us, many a one, which go upward and out of sight. And then he says, sleep lingers all our lifetime about our eyes as night hovers all day in the boughs of the fir tree. All things swim and glitter. Our life is not so much threatened as our perception. Ghost-like, we glide through nature and should not know our place again. And he goes on in this way. And it's very clear to me that he's thinking about this Tennysonian redefinition of experience in Ulysses. And what it is for Emerson, and of course what it must have been for Tennyson, is a way to think about grief as this ever disappearing horizon, where your emotional state feels secure one moment and then immediately disappears. It's an arch where through gleams that untraveled world. Incredible passage. Really recommend, by the way, that Emerson essay. He says, dream delivers us to dream, and there is no end to illusion. I feel like he and Tennyson are really on the same page. So Tennyson sort of chucks that out there as being a kind of paradox of one's experience, that it amounts to nothing. And then he pivots. He pivots to his son. He says, this is my son, mine own Telemachus. Telemachus. What do you say?
Telemachus.
This is my son, mine own Telemachus, to whom I leave the sceptre and the isle. This is full Prospero now. Well
It
loved of
is.
me, discerning to fulfill this labour by slow
I mean,
prudence.
it's also John of Gaunt and Richard II as
Yes, I
well.
was thinking about this sceptred isle. Yes, love that speech. This labour by slow prudence to make mild a rugged people. He's really hammering home this idea that he's in charge of a bunch of savages. And through soft degrees subdue them to the useful and the good. Most blameless is he, centred in the sphere of common duties, decent not to fail in offices of tenderness, and pay meet adoration to my household gods when I am gone. He works his work, I mine. Jonty, if your dad said that to you, handing off the company business, saying that you're blameless, centered in the sphere of common duties, that you're decent not to fail in offices of tenderness, how would you feel about that?
Well, it's not very sexy, is it?
No, it's not kind of power move. You
No,
don't.
but
Let's put it this way: you don't want to be Telemachus in this situation.
well, unless you're Alfred Tennyson and you had the father you had, who was just chaotic and tyrannical and a
Yes,
drunkard
that's
and
a good point.
violent, and
That's a good
actually
point.
a bit of sound business speak, focusing on blamelessness and being centered and performing common duties and decency and tenderness, I think would go down rather well.
No, that's fair. That's fair. Although it also very much sums up the spirit of the Tennysonian household. He works his work, I mine. It's kind of every man for himself. So he hands things off to Telemachus and says to Telemachus, you've got this, son. You're the sort of fellow who is decent not to fail. And I suppose the implication is that it might very well be Ulysses' lot in life to be a failure. That might be his kind of job description. What makes him a truly outstanding hero is that he's always up for failing. And so he turns his eye portward And Jonty, despite your appalling viral symptoms, why don't you give us this next moment of resolution on the poet's part?
Well, I've already done it, but I'll do it again in the hope that that the experience of listening to it will be transformed from what it was earlier, thus showing the power of what we do on The Secret Life of Books. That
Mm.
a bit of text we read out just over an hour ago and felt a bit opaque and incomprehensible now feels like the clouds have parted and the divine rays of comprehension and creative brilliance are shining down
Oh, beautiful.
on everyone listening to this podcast. So there lies the port. The vessel puffs her sails. I'm going to stop on puffs because, of course, what puffs in 1833 is the new railway system, and it's a lovely way.
Beautiful.
It's a lovely way of Tennyson saying you may think this poem is about the Greek myth, but it's also about today and the modern world, and we are all Ulysses in our way. So I think that's a very clever little shout out to the railway.
Oh,
There
I
lies
love
the
that.
port. The vessel puffs her sail, there gloom the dark broad seas. My mariners, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with me, that ever with a frolic welcome took the thunder and the sunshine and opposed free hearts, free foreheads, you and I are old. Old age have yet his honour and his toil. Death closes all, but something ere the end, some work of noble note may yet be done. Not unbecoming men that strove with gods, the lights begin to twinkle from the rocks. The long day wanes, the slow moon climbs, the deep moans round with many voices. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world.
Oh,
Push off, and sitting well in order smite the sounding furrows, for my purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. Now, as we get into the final lines, just remember that when he says Achilles, he's saying Arthur. That's what he's saying. Arthur Hallam is his Achilles. And if there
love
is
that.
a dry eye, if there is a dry
Mm.
eye at the end of whoever's listening to this, well, I'll be very surprised.
Yeah.
It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides. And though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, that which we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield.
Oh, it's very beautiful. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because it seems like there's a very straight line from that ending, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield, to the lines that Virginia Woolf makes so much of into The Lighthouse, where Mr. Ramsay repeatedly says, from The Charge of the Light Brigade, Tennyson's late life poem, stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death, into the mound of hell, rode the 600. That's that's the sort of imperialistic Tennyson, the Tennyson who is incorrectly remembered as this figure of kind of imperial or military voicing of this sort of Victorian appetite for, English global success in the empire. I don't think that's the Tennyson that's speaking in Ulysses at all. I think the Tennyson of Ulysses is this grief-stricken Tennyson who is longing for a sense of purpose. But it is interesting that, you know in those last lines is the kernel of the version of Tennyson that's going to make the modernists so allergic to the Victorians and to their sense of, you know being beleaguered and, in the midst of sort of the great game of empire that Virginia Woolf has to parody in the character of Mr. Ramsay into The Lighthouse, that Lytton Strachey has to write back to with Eminent Victorians and his kind of takedown of Victorianism, that the T.S. Eliot really goes after in The Wasteland and The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. All, that version of Victorianism is kind of emerging at the very end of Ulysses. But when you put it in the context of the passage you read immediately before, it totally changes the quality of it. That extraordinary line that's always been one of my favorites. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks, the long day wanes. I mean, it's such a vivid image that we've all seen of light starting to come on, in a seaside town or something as the day finishes. And I think what Tennyson is getting at here is that he's getting this sense of a twinkling, of a glimmering, of the possibility of sailing beyond the sunset. This idea that there might actually be a glimpse of happiness after just absolutely devastating grief.
Yeah. So, Sophie, let's wrap things up. What happens next is over the 1830s, he can't bring himself to publish anything.
Yeah,
He's
too
been
upset.
destroyed, but he's too upset. And then on the encouragement of friends like Fitzgerald, he does in 1842, and he publishes poems in 2 volumes. Again, inspired by Wordsworth's 2 volume presentation at the start of the century, and it is an immediate sensation.
Massive
Uh, Ed,
smash.
Edgar Allan Poe, on the other side of the pond, says, I am not sure that Tennyson is not the greatest of poets, which is a very Poe double negative
Yeah,
way
it's a
of
bit
saying he thinks
roundabout.
that
Yeah,
Tennyson is the greatest of poets.
yeah.
And he then, a few years after that, in 1850, he suddenly drops. I mean, this is the equivalent of, a surprise drop by Taylor Swift. He drops in memoriam. No one is expecting this book to come out, which is the 133 elegies he had been writing and squirreling away about Arthur Hallam alongside all the other poems he'd written. And that publishes in 1850, and it immediately becomes the most successful work of poetry of the 19th century.
So I guess the way to frame that would be to say that Arthur Hallam was Tennyson's Trojan War. It was
Yes,
it was his purpose. It was the way that he found his voice. It was the way not only that he found his way into the world after a devastating childhood, but it was actually in losing Hallam, it was the way he found his way into poetry too.
yeah. In Memoriam publishes 60,000 copies in the year of its publication. Queen Victoria, a fave of the show, announced
Yeah,
she kept a
friend of the
copy
show.
by her bed. And that same year, Wordsworth died. He'd been poet laureate, and Tennyson was appointed poet laureate in his place.
Instead, yeah.
And then just a couple of years after that, he publishes Maud in 1855, which is this amazing, long, fragmented poem, which was a big influence on T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound.
Yes,
And
I
as
love
you
it.
said, he publishes Charge of Light Brigade, which is not a jingoistic poem. It is an imperial protest poem. And the
Right.
first version that he published he was so appalled by what he read in the papers about the kind of loss of this entire regiment of the army through bad leadership. He read
Yeah.
it in the papers and then sat down and wrote the poem that morning. And he had the word blundered in the original version, which is the version we have. But he had to remove the word blundered at the time. But because every verse has a word that rhymes with blundered, blundered becomes conspicuous through
Right.
its absence. And then, of course, the word was put back in. So even Charge of the Light Brigade, which we see as being this very high Victorian jingoistic poem, is nothing of the sort whatsoever.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, it's the word blundered that Woolf actually picks up on into the lighthouse. And it's one of the
Yes,
motifs that runs through to the lighthouse and very much speaks to the way in which the modernists are responding to the Victorians. I mean, on the one hand, they're sort of seeing Victorianism as a blunder, but they're also sort
yes,
of seeing themselves as being caught in this world of, what's euphemistically being called blundering, but this kind of the
yes.
chaos, the complete dissolution of the systems that they thought were in place, the loss, the grief, all these conditions that Tennyson actually is fundamentally grappling with in Memoriam, obviously in Ulysses, and as you say, in the Charge of the Light Brigade.
And by 1855, the great stuff is sort of done. The problem is, from a literary point of view, is that he lives on for another 40
Right.
years and becomes and by the end of his life has become the establishment figure who every young poet worth their salt has to rebel against. But I think what we found out over this episode is really what an extraordinary, radical, and brilliant voice he was in those early decades of his life.
Absolutely amazing. So joyful to take our story of the Odyssey forward, Jonty, with this. It's actually my favorite reworking of the Odyssey. Um,
Same.
I find it infinitely moving and beautiful. And I think it's also going to help us to appreciate the Odysseys that are going to come afterwards, because we're moving into what for most people is the most famous of all the Odyssean rewritings, which is James Joyce's. We're
Yeah,
not going there directly, mind you. We've got lots of twists and turns before we get there.
not least talking about Christopher Nolan's film, which we will be
Exactly.
doing very soon.
You've been listening to The Secret Life of Books.